Welcome to Syntax. Today, we're going to be talking about fonts on the web. There's so much here. There's a lot of new stuff from how we are able to trim and display fonts to variable fonts, fallbacks, and so much more stuff that I think everybody just can really level up their typography overall by learning some really basic skills here, but also new features on the web. My name is Scott Talinsky. I'm a developer from Denver. With me, as always, is Wes Boss. What's up, Wes?
Hey, yeah, fonts are a never-ending well of sort of digging into it, both in CSS and then once you get into like custom fonts and variable fonts, it's just this wide world. And we are going to attempt to show you some of the things that you as a developer should know about, especially a lot of these sort of newer features that are either now supported or are coming relatively soon.
Before we get started, let's talk about, actually, Sentry just released their own font. Did you see this, Wes?
Yes, I did. What's it called again?
Damn It Sans, I believe, Blink-182 reference here. So, yeah, go check that out. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. Looks nice, actually. It's kind of cool to have your own typeface at a company, right?
Yeah. What a cool thing to do that. It was a Hack Week project, and they went ahead and started using it on. I think that they're using it on the merch store as well. I didn't realize that when we redesigned the Syntax merch store, it's available at sentry.shop, that they were using this custom font. I remember being like, yeah, I really like this font. Big fan of how this looks. Fan. So yeah, check it out. And a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking today has to do with like font performance as well. If you've got like layout shift, you're going to see that in your Sentry Performance tab as well. So you certainly don't want layout shift because of your fonts, and we're going to tell you how to fix that today.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, if you want to check out the Sentry font, do it, but I'd highly recommend you check out Sentry as a product at sentry.io/syntax. Sign up and get 2 months for free. It's the perfect place to make sure that your code does not suck because, hey, you can fix all of your bugs and issues just by heading to the Sentry dashboard. I even used their wizard the other day. In fact, they have a wizard for several platforms, and the wizard for getting Sentry going on SvelteKit, just run the wizard, and then that's it. You can't.
The Next.js one is also fantastic as well. It just because there's client side, there's server side, there's edge. There's like 3 different runtimes. They all talk to each other, and it's very good to get integrated.
Yeah. Gotta love that. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's get going here. The first thing we want to touch on is, we have FontFace for defining custom fonts. Before we had at FontFace, you had a choice of like 6 fonts or something on the web, or you could
way back.
You could use Helvetica and have a fallback to Arial or something like that. And people who had a Mac would get Helvetica. People who had a Windows would get Arial, and then, whatever. But along comes at FontFace. We can load up our own custom fonts. We can use our fonts. And along with that, we have a lot of other things, such as font display. Can you maybe get a little deep into what font display is?
The thing about custom fonts is they are great. However, if your custom fonts take a long time to download, you get into this space where what do you do if you're trying to use a custom font, but that font is not available or it is not yet downloaded, right? Normally, a font stack will just try the first one and then try the second one, et cetera, et cetera. But when you define a custom font, you need to also define how long it should wait and if it should wait while it's downloading. So that's what the font display property does. You set it to either auto, which allows the user agent, the browser, to figure out what the best case was. Often that's a really good choice for the auto, or like the default for a lot of these properties, not just fonts in general, but it's sometimes better to just let the browser figure out what to do in that case. However, if you do want full control over it, you start to think about the kind of 3 different periods. There's a blocking period in which the font is being downloaded and an invisible font is being shown. So if you've ever been to a website and you don't see any text at all, what's happening is it's rendering out the text invisibly, and then it's downloading the font. So that's called the blocking period, and you kind of want to minimize that because it's annoying to sit there and wait for it to download.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why you do have to wait for it to download is fonts are not small.
No.
They're often disregarded as, oh, you just load up a font and there you go. But especially as we get into variable fonts, which we'll talk about in a bit, that include a lot more information in them, and even just a handful of any other fonts are not small loads. So that could be a period of time, especially if you're loading it in a slow manner. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the block period, which it attempts to download the font and shows you nothing. You have the swap period, which is the amount of time that it uses a fallback or another font while you're trying to download that one. And then you have the failure period, which is, oh, this font, we're not able to download it. We can't find it. It's not working at all. So what you want to do is set your font display to either, you probably don't want to set it to block unless you're explicitly like you're rendering a poster or something that needs to be printed to PDF. Maybe in that case you want to block and wait for the font to be loaded.
That font, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But swap will give you extremely small blocking period, and then immediately swap out. And then fallback gives you a small blocking period and a short swap period, meaning that you can try to load your custom font and it will fall back, or it will swap to Times New Roman, or if that's your second font, right? Or if you don't specify anything, that's what it's gonna swap over to. But that can be kind of jarring if you were to try to download something, switch to the fallback, and then it does download, and then you switch back to it, and you get this sort of like right, the cumulative layout shift or the re-rendering of the actual font. So the difference between swap and fallback is swap will always swap it out once it's done downloading. And fallback will only give you a short period in which it can be downloaded. Otherwise, it's going to start to use the fallback value.
I guess the big question for me is, why doesn't Auto just take care of these situations?
It does. That's exactly what Auto does. The browser will decide based on assuming things like network speed, device, etc., what the best use case is for the user, because you as the developer cannot possibly account for every single use case. So Auto is probably your best bet.
Yeah, word.
Now, the swap, you may want to put a swap on there. And if that is the case, you don't want to have what's called cumulative layout shift, meaning that if the font that you swapped to, and then once it's downloaded, the font that you're swapping back to have different characters, different sizes, what's going to happen is the text is going to shift up or down, or words are going to wrap. That's a really annoying one, right? If you're starting to read a sentence, the font loads, and then all of a sudden your context for where you were has changed.
Yeah, start over.
You can use the ascent override, descent override, and line gap override values, where you can basically take something that is loaded on the user's computer. So for example, you can say local Arial, and that will load up Arial that's loaded on your user's computer, and then it will stretch all of the values of Arial to match the actual file, the font that you're trying to load. And those values can be figured out. Next.js Nuxt Fontaine will automatically do that. That's why when you use Next, they want you to use their own font integration rather than just loading it in a CSS link and going for it. But if you do not use any of those, you can, there's a whole bunch of tools out there. FontKit is probably the most popular one. That's what Next.js uses. FontKit will basically look at your font during build time, measure these values, and then set your fallback font to stretch to perfectly fit that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's an example. At font face, it's called Fallback for Poppins, which it falls back to Times New Roman. It stretches the ascents 105%. It's not stretches, compresses the descents 35%, and then overrides the line gap between the two, so you don't get that jarring change.
Man, That's great. Yeah.
Yes. This is kind of like the like images, you know, like with images, you have to like compress and size in different formats and source set multiple versions of it, you know, that
Yeah.
stuff is, you're never going to do that stuff unless you have a tool that is built into your build chain.
Yeah. Have you heard of this Fontaine? It's an UnJS package.
Yes, that's what Next uses, and they're recommending it on the Google blog here.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool tool here.
I'm a big fan of that. You just drop it. So you grab a font, drag and drop it in there. It'll give you the value. So you don't even have to. I just said you have to have it as part of your build chain. You don't have to. You could do this simply when you're loading your font. You just drag your font into here and it will give you the value straight up.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So next up are variable fonts. Now, variable fonts are interesting because I feel like this was a feature that, some people have talked about a little bit, but variable fonts include a lot of things, and each variable font is different, which is part of maybe the challenge of working with them.
They have variables.
So you can't necessarily approach. They do. They have variables, which is, as programmers, we love variables. You can change them, you can update them, whatever. And with variable fonts, you can update these variables to change the font. It makes them variable themselves. So whether that is increasing the boldness by a certain amount in a way that the font is actually intended to, instead of just like a browser adding chunkiness to a font like some other fonts, you can actually have a sliding scale of how bold this is. But not only like boldness and italicizing things and that, you can also get into individual modifications of individual glyphs. Like the font that we use on Syntax, MDIO. You can set a value for the font variation settings, which is the CSS property that you use to tweak these things. And you can set a variable in there or a value in there to even swap out the 0. For ours, there's multiple 0 options. There's a 0 with a line through it. There's a 0 with a dot in the center. There's options with variable fonts, and you can tweak it to your heart's content based on what the font offers. And it's really pretty neat. The thing that can bite people with variable fonts sometimes is that the mode of setting these things is different than what we're used to, right? We're used to font weight bold, font weight 500, something like that, right? Font style. Where with variable fonts, you have this font variation settings property. And inside of there, you give it like a key and then a value. So for the font weight is WGHT and then a number, or italicized can be either like a sliding scale or a 0 to 1. But every font is just a slightly different in what they offer. And that's why there's this really great tool that Stephen Nixon showed us on our episode where we had him on talking about building fonts, which is the Wakame Fondue. I don't know the significance of that name, but basically you drop in your variable font inside of this tool, and it not only tells you all of the different possible settings or anything like that, it gives you CSS classes to use certain modifications to your font. That way, or you can set CSS variables, or you can give certain classes a thing, or you can just utilize it to see what the options are even available for your specific variable font. It's really pretty neat to dive into, and sometimes I can geek out on just how many things you can tweak with these variable fonts.
Yeah, it's really cool because the variations are not preset, meaning that it's not like, fonts can have like weight and width and height and things like that. Like the values can be anything. Like I'm got a demo going right now called the variable poo demo. And it's from 100 to 900. And depending on where you're at, the size of the hat and the eye angle are changed, which is hilarious. Or like how wide the stroke is on something. So variable fonts can be multicolor as well, which is kind of interesting. Look at this one, X-Ray. It has 6 different possible values that you can change on it. It's just wild. And often these are a really good choice for when you need to make things bolder without changing the actual size of your text. Because if you were to make a font bolder, they would often change the width of the text, and that would cause a reflow. Whereas many of these variable fonts will allow you to change the weight without changing the size of it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to like about variable fonts. Even if it's just tweaking it ever so slightly to make it original or something. Like on my website, Wes, we have like a little L, right, with that font. And I just changed that one specific L. So I was able to change that character. So anytime it was a heading and an L, it added a little other Q to it.
Oh, this?
Sorry, it's the I. The I is the one
Yes.
that I changed. If you look at my name, Scott Talinsky on there, the I has like some extra little feet on it. And I was able to do that by changing some font variation settings.
That is awesome. I love that you can simply just change out one of the letters, because often these fonts they're kind of fancy and you love it for everything except when you hit the like L or H or something.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a little bit too fancy for me, you know? Or in Scott's case, not fancy enough. And
Yeah.
it looks like a little guy running.
I know, right? Yeah, I know. It was so fun to go through that because some of them did look kind of like a little L, or you could change them and stuff, and just really nice. Yeah.
Love that. It's so fun diving into all these fonts. The font size, I guess, like we talked about loading them, but they are generally larger, or it really depends, I guess. Hey,
I would say they're almost always larger. Specifically,
okay.
I mean, unless
But
you're like
larger
dealing with
than loading
a small
in three
subset.
weights.
Well, that's the thing. Yes. So we were doing that on the syntax site. We were loading in several weights of the font, several like italic weights and whatever. And I don't know if the end cost ended up saving us cost at the end of the day. I probably should have done that math. All I know is that it wasn't a huge hit, and it made more sense to use the variable font because that way we could just load one file, right?
Yeah. Then the world's your oyster. Because like on my website, I've got one font that I have to load the regular and the book version, and then the regular italic and the book italic. You know, that's 4 weights. And I'm wondering if there was a variable version of that available, if it would be smaller than needed. But then on the other half is that the font isn't downloaded unless it's needed on that page.
Yeah. So then, yeah,
it's always a dance. You know, you got to figure it out yourself. I'm happy with the loading strategy I have, but it's always something I'm thinking about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, variable fonts, super cool. And Wes, also, you said you were looking at this v-fonts.com. I don't know if you said that explicitly, but v-fonts.com is a really cool website to not only just see what's out there, but also just to experiment and mess with fonts and play around with them and see like what kind of cool things you can do. You know, you can animate these properties too. So like, you can do a lot with this stuff. I mean, you could do a lot of creative work with them.
Animating the like weight of specific letters while the other letters are less. You can make this really cool kind of wave animation, you know? Yeah. Look at this one, Corona face impact. Somebody changed the bags under the eyes, how big the beard is. And
oh my God.
Whether or not there's a face mask.
That's hilarious. Wow.
I need to make a font. That's just
People
like one.
Creative.
I often think about like areas. I'm learning like 3D modeling right now. And I often think about areas of my life where I'm like, I have never in my life, I wouldn't even know where to start. How do you make a font? I'm assuming you just make every letter in like Illustrator or whatever. But
go listen to the episode with Stephen Nixon. We talk a lot about that. You were out of town for that one, I believe. Yeah, CJ and I did that.
All right. That would be really cool. Last thing we want to talk about is this new property to CSS that is text box trim and text box edge. And if you are someone who either obsesses over like padding or spacing and margin, or someone whose designer says, can you move it up 3 pixels because they come back to you with a bunch of lines overlaid, you're going to be very, very happy about this, because the line height of a font is from the top of the caps, like the top of like an H, all the way down to the bottom of your descender, which is like a Y or a G that will come down. And often that
Yeah.
will look funny if you don't have any characters that have that space above it. You have some margin, and it seems like it's added some extra padding or margin because of the spacing on the font. So text box trim will allow you to trim off that extra space on the top or the bottom. And then text box edge will allow you to specify where those trimming lines happen, either by the ascenders, the cap lines, the X height, which is the height of an X, base height, baseline, or descender line, which that's like Latin characters. Once you get into like Chinese characters, it's even more wild.
Yeah, you know what? One of the biggest things for me that this will solve is like, man, I get so angry doing padding for buttons because you're like, okay, the top just needs a little bit different than the bottom.
It looks weird.
You got to get in there and fine tune it. Yeah, it looks weird. So just trim it off. And I feel like that's going to make my life so much easier in terms of just making nicer looking buttons. But fonts are like very different too. You can never like necessarily predict that like what that line height will actually look like.
No, sometimes fonts. I get sometimes they get a font and the line height is just wacky, and you just have to account for that when it's that font. But then if it's a font fallback, it's a little bit more weird. So I'm very much looking forward to this. Let's talk real quick about browser support for that. Browser support is actually very good. It's been in Chrome for February 3. Man, it just hit Chrome like a month ago.
Hit Chrome. Yeah.
It just hit Safari
in December 2024.
And it's not in Firefox yet. But this is another one of those like nice to haves where it's kind of like the new color spaces as well. It just looks better on browsers that support it, but it's not like it's going to totally break.
Yeah, Firefox. Come on. Between this and their like new privacy stuff or whatever. I mean, Firefox has been a bit of a bummer for a bit for me. So I just, I'm a little annoyed with it.
Yeah. But that's in all the other ones. It's actually really funny that Safari is often the first on these things when it has to do with design and presentation. Yeah, aesthetics.
Color and font and all that stuff they're in on. And then they're explicitly stubborn about many other things that I wish they weren't.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's all of our little nuggets for CSS fonts. There's obviously a lot more to it, but these are things we think you should know. Anything else to add there, Scott?
I don't. No, nothing.
Beautiful. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you later. Peace.
Peace.